we are joined by Dr. Martyn Davies, the automotive sector leader for Deloitte Africa. Dr. Davies, are you with us, sir?
Yes, I'm here. Good to be joining you, and thanks for your time.
Fantastic. Doctor, your topic is, I think, very topical at the moment. A lot of people questioning and asking about the dynamics and how it's going to affect the local market of EVs. So I think myself and Jaco are going to get out the way and let you take it forward, and we'll chat to you at the end with some questions. I'm sure we're going to have quite a few questions coming from our audience, and looking forward to your insights, sir.
Sounds good. Thank you very much, and appreciate the opportunity. I do have load shedding or power cuts here where I am, so hopefully I get through the next 45 minutes or so. Again, maybe that's the first barrier to overcome for EVs. It's the consistency of power supply, isn't it? And we have our unique context of range anxiety or charging anxiety in South Africa or this part of the world. So building on what's been said, my job this morning is just pretty much to talk about what I think are some of the dynamics that are shaping the local market, and perhaps ones which are looking at lessons elsewhere or emerging lessons elsewhere, and ultimately what does it mean for South Africa, and how does this the shift in or potential shift in powertrain play out in the automotive industry. Just to sort of set the scene, now for some reason, it's something dramatic happened, I think, in the last 2 months in one of the world's major automotive markets, and one which particularly shapes ours, particularly from the export perspective. I'm talking about the UK here. Is in the last 2 years, for whatever reason, there's been a dramatic rise, predominance, awareness of all things tech, and that's a very, very big word. And for reasons we don't quite understand or quite fathom, is that there's been, excuse the pun, an acceleration of this shift in powertrain in the automotive industry. But something more recent happened, I think around October, November last year, which has really given significant impetus to the EV adoption, particularly in Western Europe, in the UK in particular. And it's the following. If you recall, I think it was back in November, for reasons, again, whether it was sort of post-Brexit poor planning, whether it was just, temporary supply chain issues. But if you recall the fuel crisis or the fuel supply crisis in the UK that took place, 3 odd months ago, where we saw people being unable to refuel their cars, their internal combustion engine vehicles, the queues, almost Zimbabwe style, at petrol station forecourts of people queuing on motorway services, on retail forecourts throughout the country. And there was this massive national anxiety around the supply of fuel in the UK. I think that was a pivotal moment, because what we've seen is so-called range anxiety used to be about, I'm driving an EV, where will I get it charged, and will I make my destination? There was a fundamental shift, I think, when this took place, when range anxiety shifted from focus on EVs to a focus on combustion engines. And it was a supply side issue, supply side of fuel. And because of that dramatic shift, we saw a dramatic event in Q4 last year in the UK. As a result, in December, and the figures will even be probably stronger now, as obviously orders and backlog of orders will come through, is that 26% of all new car sales in the UK in December last year were EVs, 26%. So the COVID period, for reasons we don't quite understand, was an accelerator towards this trend. But this dramatic event of fuel supply in the UK resulted in a significant, I think, a new sense of consumer awareness around what is range anxiety, and it came down to fuel supply, not charging capacity. And that reflects also what some of the sentiment that you were talking earlier around the companies like grid cars and charging infrastructure and the like. Just a small point to begin with. So how tech is changing the sector. At Deloitte, we put some thought into this, or at least we tried to, around this digital disruption map. And this looking back with hindsight, if we can do that the last 2 years. And the shift towards so-called digitization, call it tech adoption, call it convergence of technologies, call it automation. That's what I mean by digitization. Has impacted some industries certainly more than others. The least impacted industry is government, and we kind of all feel that, don't we? How have our or the state's delivery of not the US, but the state as a concept, the government's delivery of public goods and services improved or not in the last 2 years? Probably minimal to probably in reverse gear. However, we've seen in terms of retail, we all know, my wife literally has every day I'm just expecting a doorbell to ring from another courier company delivering something that the wife has ordered on, I don't know, Takealot. So the retail sector typically is sort of being massively impacted around the digital technology, FMCG as well, financial services, of course, but auto is right up there. And this is something which we're trying to figure out, both from a manufacturing perspective, from a consumer perspective, even from a retail perspective. How autos, I think you may be talking about this, how is consumer interacting with what is a traditional piece of hardware to now software as a service into those vehicles, and how, the whole thing of tech is impacting the automotive industry. But in this context is around powertrain, and that's what I want to focus on. And one last picture, if I may. So a nice quote from Bill Gates is, I think it's quite relevant now. Most people overestimate what they can do in 1 year, and underestimate what they can do in 10. And what I mean by this was a picture I was able to get off the internet, literally about a decade apart. This was New York City in 1900, 122 years ago, thereabouts, almost to the month. And if you look carefully, everyone is traveling around the city in horse-drawn carts. And I think there's one internal combustion engine vehicle down there amongst all the horses and the carts. A very short, relatively speaking, decade or so later, spot the horse and cart. Same spot, pretty much, on the streets of Manhattan in New York City. You see one horse and cart, and the rest are internal combustion engines. That was 120 odd years ago, just over a century. I think not in South Africa, more on this later, but we've passed the pivotal point, the inflection point, the turning point, whatever phrase you'd like to use, around this shift in powertrain and how dramatic an impact this will have on certain economies globally. Economies that are far more highly regulated. Consumers are more aware. Consumers, where there's a sense of greater environmental consciousness in society, where countries are able to subsidize and have the fiscal headspace to support a new industry effectively emerging, in countries that are more agile and from a policy perspective, and abilities to implement policies very rapidly, despite their small size and relatively small market for new tech, likes of the UAE, South Korea, Singapore, Norway, Scandinavian countries, amongst others. There'll be first movers, and of course, there will be late adopters or partial adopters. And South Africa certainly will fall into the latter category. And that's what I want to talk about. So, again, a risk of repetition, apologies if you've heard this before, I'm sure you have in the course of yesterday, but just some sort of stats to support the trend. I spent a lot of my my formative years in China. I studied in China, worked a lot in China. And China today is the world's largest EV market by volume. I think it's roughly about 1.2 million electric vehicles per year being sold in the market. And of course, China's ability to, the Chinese state's ability to disrupt itself and adopt tech by disrupting or attacking vested interests in other transportation modes is quite unique in China. At the same time, there's significantly less of a legacy around some sort of emotional attachment to an internal combustion engine. Think V8 engines or flat sixes if you're of the Porsche variety. There's a far, China's a country where the speed of development and wealth accumulation has been so rapid that literally it's unprecedented, where you have literally, I've seen it, 3 generations of people learning to drive at the same time. That is what's happened in China, because the wealth accumulation has been so rapid. People before could not afford a car. So you literally see older people. You go to Chinese driving schools. When I was there, this goes back even 15, 20 years. And you see 60-year-olds with 18-year-olds learning to drive together because now they can all afford a car. And also, China's adoption of EV has been inextricably linked to its environmental policies and its urban strategies, so-called smart city strategies, and is really, really way ahead of the curve when compared to almost all competitor or aspirant automotive industries globally. And something else, which is the real driver, and this I think is very important, the real driver of Chinese competitiveness in the, not so much enabler, but driver. Enablers of what I just said, and also obviously mass market, sizable market, significant number of consumers, wealthy consumers who can afford vehicles. But the ultimate driver is as follows. The first Western multinational JV in China, automotive OEM, was VW. It goes back to 1983 and set up 2 JVs in Shanghai with the Shanghai municipal government. And despite literally every BMW brilliance, Beijing municipal government with Hyundai, you see all the JVs that have been forged, using the neutral word, by the Chinese government. Despite these JVs, the Chinese automotive players have not become as competitive as Western multinational companies, OEMs. Think the likes of Mercedes-Benz, Ford, VW in particular, and all the others. Why? Because of powertrain technology, arguably, I would argue. And the Chinese state sees this as seen this as a long-range major opportunity as a power shift takes place to really finally be able to compete and beat the traditional OEMs at their own game of making automotives, because the competitive advantage resided in the powertrain, not in the rest of the car. And this is a real point of strategic opportunity as the Chinese state and automotive industry sees it to gain number 1 spot. They've realized they could not do like the Koreans, the likes of Hyundai, Kia in particular, and compete with the best with equal powertrains on the same technology platform. So the Chinese seek to use EV to effectively EV powertrain to ultimately succeed in the automotive industry, not just in China, but globally. That's the thinking, and that's the strategic play. So on the EV, sorry, I have slides, but we don't really need them. But I'll just talk to some issues. What I think will happen, and you mentioned bus companies and industries, is we have to segment this. I'm relatively pessimistic, negative on the adoption of EVs for passenger sedans in South Africa for a number of reasons. I'm very optimistic around the adoption of EVs for light commercial vehicles, and particularly in the courier space. So EVs will be led in South Africa by the likes of the multinational courier companies and the large listed logistics companies. not so much in terms of long range, but intra-city. Companies like DHL, UPS, the FedExes of this world, but Imperial Logistics, these sort of companies will move very fast, and we will have a intra-urban logistics sector with light commercial delivery vehicles, fully EV, I think, before any other segment. Long distance trucks, no. Again, charging infrastructure, technology, weight issues, state of roads, probably not. Buses, possible. Private, yes. Great potential, but it may be challenging from a state perspective to be able, from a government's perspective, to manage this. Private sector, yes. Government, probably less so. And more on that sort of shortly. But as I said earlier, just on the right-hand side chart, just getting relevant, is that the dramatic increase, of course, has this been regulatory driven or consumer driven? Initially, it's been regulatory driven. Now it's increasingly consumer supported and consumer driven as well. Consumers want EVs for many reasons already outlined. But the regulatory impetus to drive the adoption of EVs for consumers is essential to start the trend. Otherwise, it is not going to happen. You mentioned the comments from the DTIC. How will regulation drive EV adoption from a passenger sedan perspective? Will it be punitive, carbon tax? Maybe it's already happening, not so much overtly, but by stealth. And what's happened this week in petrol price increases is one thing. Would it happen, through incentive? Probably not. We haven't got the fiscal means to incentivize consumers. Quite the opposite. There's punitive taxes on EVs imported in South Africa, not incentive taxes. So again, these are fact, plus not to mention, which I'm sure has been discussed in great detail, cost of entry into the EV market. EVs are very expensive cars currently. If that price point will drop, of course, particularly as more competition comes in the sector, as the Western multinational OEMs start to produce cars that are less profitable and more mass market. The first models are always going to be more expensive, hence the Porsche Taycan stereotypically, or the Audi GT series. These are very expensive vehicles. Ultimately, it will start to filter down to smaller type passenger sedans and cheaper. But most importantly is as particularly Chinese brands, the likes of BYD, amongst others, who will think about entering markets like South Africa and offering consumers vehicles that are actually affordable rather than merely aspirational. So, sharp increase in EV sales in Europe, of course. The US will be a laggard. The United States is an odd one because we see it, there's exceptions, of course. You've got the two slivers of the United States, sort of California and East Coast, and Middle America. So California will be very progressive, of course, but arguably the rest of the country will not. And again, the US will definitely be a very big laggard for an array of reasons. China, I've already mentioned, has been driving this from a regulatory perspective. But that shift in Europe over the course of the last, these are slightly dated figures, the shift in Europe in the last year or two has undoubtedly been dramatic. And again, this is assisted by a very strong countering climate change agenda, which of course, removing at the very least curbside emissions, and letting consumers feel a bit better about themselves. But again, it always talks to the whole, supply of energy generation, and not to mention the dramatic events that are unfolding in Ukraine and Russia in the course of the last literally week, how the world has changed, and how this will dramatically result, without a shift in government in Moscow in the near future, dramatically result in a impetus to drive renewable energy and less oil and gas dependence in Western Europe. And this will have quite profound implications, I think, into how energy is ultimately sourced or generated, sourced, and fed into the European grid. Again, large Asian markets, registrations, again, China aside here, but Japan has been banking on other technologies, hydrogen is a possible option. So Japan surprisingly laggard, but as the OEMs, I think, are starting to shift, Toyotas and Nissans and the like, starting to shift towards more an EV inclination rather than toying with other, possibly better, but albeit still very expensive technologies at the present time. And Japan, I think, cannot be a standalone here. The domestic market is simply not big enough to have a different technology standard to what is taking place in other markets, particularly in Western Europe and the US. Again, from a Scandinavian perspective, again, this is subsidized highly subsidized by the state, very small populations, strong climate change agenda, and significant fiscal headspace provided by very well managed sovereign wealth funds, which are ultimately financed or have been financed by oil and gas exports. So the Scandinavians, from a percentage-wise of sales, are clearly leading the pack. Just a point, there was an article, this is very, very important, I think. There was an article in the Financial Times, I think it was last year, I think it was called The Brutal Math of Electric Vehicles. And what you find in countries like the UK is that, and they haven't really thought this through, but we'll have to face it right now, particularly in light of high debt levels post-COVID stimulus that these economies have received, the whole furlough schemes and subsidization and the like, is that what you've seen is that as these cars, these new EVs are being subsidized, the cost of ownership and running these cars is somewhat less, not terribly much, but somewhat less than fueling it, especially in light of high fuel prices and significant inflation on the fuel side in recent times, and petrol in particular. Diesel will disappear from passenger sedans almost exceedingly quickly, and buying a diesel vehicle now new, your residual value will be basically extremely low, if anything. But the brutal math is as follows: is because of the subsidies and the loss of fuel tax that vehicle is no longer using, it's been calculated in the UK that for every 1 million EVs on average across the price points sold, the UK Treasury is losing something like £4 billion of revenue. So I'll say that again: 1 million cars sold, revenue loss £4 billion. Rhetorical question: if by some miracle South African consumers start to purchase EVs en masse, the impact it would have on a treasury would be dramatic, to say the least. And this is what I think the article was referring to when I talk about the brutal math of EVs. Because that loss of revenue to the national treasury through fuel tax will be dire. So how do you price in a developed West European market? How do you price? How does the state gain tax from EVs? Is it tax? Is it a they've yet to figure this out. On the electrification side, do you price energy supply accordingly beyond what it currently is? Do you price per mile or per kilometer driven, pay per use? Okay, maybe. How do EVs continue to get, avoiding the congestion charge in London or wherever it may be? How do you start to think about, how does the state think about creating new, innovative, sustainable revenue streams in an EV dominant market? That's the real question here, and something which no Western European government has really thought through. But this is the next big thing, is from Treasury's perspective, how do we think about this? So the Chinese market I've mentioned is the dominance and the range of EVs, particularly in China. And again, this talks to Chinese, predominance of Chinese EV companies, ones we've never heard of yet. We know the BYDs, we know the NIOs, many others, but there's many other Chinese brands which will go global in the coming years. And these are the companies, I think, which could be the major beneficiaries from the EV shift, particularly new markets that are starting to adopt EVs quite quickly. I'm going to fly through some of this. It's maybe not relevant. Electric heavy-duty vehicles. Sorry, no, time's a little bit tight, so I'll cut this short. But as I mentioned, light commercial vehicles will lead the pack, undoubtedly. Intra-urban, not long haul, but intra-urban. And you can see the others. We fall into the other category here. So we're pretty much nowhere in terms of the commercial vehicle electric sort of space. China dominates companies like I mentioned, BYD. Warren Buffett invested initially. Yutong, Zhengzhou Yutong, another company in the bus space, which is very dominant in the Chinese case. Barriers to EV adoption. Again, this is a public charging network. You can just see how the Koreans, I used to live in Korea for 2.5 years or so, and the Koreans are always ahead. It's amazing of how dramatically there's no country that so rapidly embraces tech than Korea, and how it's from a consumer perspective, it's just constant. There's no such thing as vested interest and protection of vested interest in industries or state protection, whatever it may be. Technology disrupts everything. And that's what, again, is proving the case in the context of Korea. Big electrification. So every year we at Deloitte do a very big global consumer study across 25 countries. We survey roughly 1,000 people or so in each country. And I've just extracted the results. This came out about a month and a half ago. So it's very, very up to date. And we pose questions across to 1,000 people in South Africa about what they think and what are their consumer taste trends or thoughts are currently. And these are the results I just like to share with you. So type of engine, next vehicle, 84% of South Africans want to buy a petrol car or a diesel vehicle. Now, if you were European sitting in wherever you are in Western Europe and you saw these figures, you'd be kind of horrified from a climatic perspective. But this is the significant focus that South Africans have on ICE vehicle powered ICE powered vehicles, not EVs. EVs are great. I mean, I've driven a few now. I'd like to drive more, and I was converted, and I was quite surprised, pleasantly. What an experience! The instant torque, and also the serenity of when one drives, the quietness. It's really quite amazing. It's I'm quite a convert, but again, there's the Eskom factor, and I'm experiencing it this morning. Lack of charging infrastructure, key concern to SA consumers. As mentioned, you'll be talking about this, I think, ad nauseum. It's where can we charge, and not unique to South Africa, but prevalent in South Africa. If I plug my car in, charging it wherever it may be, when I come back, will my cable still be there? That's another issue. And crime tragically impacts, disrupts, influences every single business model in this entire country, without doubt. So this is something which we really need to think about when looking at EV adoption, how we charge our vehicles, publicly going forward. Premiums for EV is acceptable. So what will South Africans pay for an EV? If your Audi entry price, I think I read, was 1.7 million rand, I think that's a bit excessive for I know it's excessive for your average consumer. Your average new car price in South Africa now, I think, is roughly around 370,000 rand possibly for an average new car price. Whereas your entry-level EV, it's probably a Mini, is probably coming in around 600 possibly, I guess, with some options, not too far off. I may be wrong, but not by much. So that's a chunk of change. It comes down to affordability. So even if we have the environmental consciousness, desire to drive EVs, if the range is not affordable, if the vehicles are not there, then all of this is moot. Is it not? It's moot. Affordability here is crucial, especially when you have a middle class that's under significant financial pressures, as it is currently. I think that's something we should not lose sight of. The draw for EVs on a consumer perception, and I'll make a provocative statement here. South African automotive consumers are not uniform. I think I would argue, and I'm sort of grown up in Johannesburg, I don't think people in Johannesburg have much of an environmental consciousness, arguably, compared to drivers or consumers in Cape Town. I think there's a far more environmental consciousness in Cape Town, for whatever reason, compared to here in Gauteng. Does the state have to price carbon? Can it price carbon more? Last week, Enoch Gondwan didn't seem to be keen on pricing carbon, raising taxes once again. And, how do we drive environmental consciousness, especially when some of the vehicles you see on our roads should not even be on the roads? And the police, the Metro Police, whoever it may be, do nothing to address this tragic fact. The impact of rising electricity prices, of course, is a major issue. Again, 9% increase. So, yes, it may be cheaper to drive an EV, but again, significant, inflation on electricity prices as well, plus continuity of supply is another factor. And this is all very sort of non-tariff barriers to entry. And to conclude, home charging will be the norm. Yes, of course. And I'm not an electrical engineer, but what about the grid? I'm guessing that most people will probably charge their car at home in the absence of public infrastructure or secure public infrastructure, coming home 6 o'clock, wherever it may be, and plugging the vehicle in. What impact will that have on the grid? Can the grid stand this? I'd like to know from an ESCOM perspective is what is necessary for the grid to be able to support large number of EVs all being charged at the same time effectively, and how will that be be balanced? And to conclude the last slide, of course, they have a positive impact. When we're not talking about we could, I guess, the longer, deeper perspective or story of value chain of the critical minerals of lithium, cobalt, copper, the PGMs, etc., that go into EVs, and how those are mined, and the transportation and the vehicle cost, etc. But at the moment, this is about a power shift. It's about removing curbside emissions and ultimately providing products that are both regulatory and consumer driven ultimately. South Africa will be a laggard, as many other countries are, for all the reasons I've outlined from a passenger sedan perspective. But ultimately, we haven't also spoken about Africa and how all these surplus, obsolete tech vehicles, particularly in diesel and petrol globally, will increasingly find a way into markets rather than being scrapped, and African markets in particular. And this is a significant force for deindustrialization and increased urban pollution in our continent if this tech shift is not recognized and both understood and pragmatically addressed by the state and pragmatically addressed by consumers in our respective markets. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it, and happy to take any comments, questions, or arguments. We have about 7 minutes. Thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Well, Dr. Davies, I think a lot of very poignant questions raised there, and a lot of points. And my co-host Yaku, he's got a couple of questions for you. I've got one quick question one of our audience members have put through, and I'm going to just remind the audience, if they would like to comment on Dr. Davies' presentation, drop it in the Q&A, and we'll try and ask you. So I have a question here this morning. Somebody asking very quickly, what is Deloitte's forecast for EVs in South Africa? And I'm going to assume maybe short, medium, and long-term future. If you can give us just a very quick, I know maybe that's a broad answer, but maybe if you can give us a quick overview of what is Deloitte's forecast for EVs in South Africa in the short, medium, and long term.
We haven't done any quantitative forecasting in terms of numbers, prediction like, we're going to have 5% or 20% or whatever it may be. We have not done that sort of work. I think just rewinding perhaps to my less quantitative but more sort of high level qualitative thoughts around sort of, we'll see it rapidly emerge in light commercial career type vehicles, light commercial intra-urban, very rapid. Passenger sedans, I feel, will be lagging the sort of adoption curve compared to more progressive developed markets. I think you'll start to see on the passenger sedans, let me break it down slightly. I think you'll start to see adoption at the very top end of the market, very top, driving premium luxury brands. That'll happen. Some of the brands I've mentioned, Mercedes-Benz, Audi, Porsche, increasingly as the models come through. The numbers are small, relatively speaking, very small, but you'll see it in the premium luxury. But the bulk of passenger sedans will remain internal combustion engines for better for worse.
Fantastic,
For
Doctor.
a good while.
I know my co-host Jaco's got a couple of questions for you.
Awesome. Dr. Davies, first of all, thank you. As always, I really enjoy your insights that you share. Perhaps the first question that I've got is the study that you did on really what is causing the lack of adoption in SA. Infrastructure being by far and most the biggest reason for people not going that route. Now, one of our speakers yesterday mentioned, and I think he said we were number 4, but let's at least say South Africa is in the top 5 of top countries in the world that has got the most charges per electric vehicle available, most public charges per electric vehicle available. So certainly it's an unfounded concern by the public. What is your view on that, first of all, and secondly, what's the best way to change that perception?
I don't know. I saw that figure, and I hear you, but where are these charges? We all drive around a lot, and obviously I haven't seen one street side, curbside, anywhere. I see we have them at our office, which is great, okay? But it was a brand new office in Waterfall. We've been able to build that. In newer buildings at a corporate level, yes, these are being built in or retrofitted, installed. But publicly, I'm not seeing it. Maybe 1 or 2 here and there, but unless maybe I'm missing something. But if I'm not actively looking, perhaps, and I know, of course, about the long distance ones on the N1 or the N3, whatever it may be, down to Durban or Cape Town, and that's helpful, extremely. But I'm skeptical because I'm just not seeing them. I was in Cape Town in December. On the streets of Cape Town CBD, are there any charging facilities? I'm not seeing them. Is it just me who thinks that, or am I missing something?
I guess, Doctor, the answer probably lies in kind of exactly what you mentioned, the tech. So I think interestingly enough, all these charges are actually publicly listed. So when driving an electric vehicle, actually on the mapping system of these cars, you actually find them. And I was doing just to check the other day for my own interest as I was driving N1 Johannesburg. And
yes.
just out of interest to see how many charges were around me. Yes, of course, the very vocal ones are along the main routes, making it possible to drive, as I'm sure a couple of the speakers have mentioned already. But I thought to myself, okay, if I need to charge now, what is available? And I did a quick check, and around me, within a radius of about 10 kilometers, there are about 7 charges. But it's about using the tech, using the mapping system. It's not necessarily something that you'll see like a fuel station as you drive, because it's typically much smaller. Typically, these stations are located within shopping centers, those type of convenience. So it really is a change on perception, change on when you would be using these charges.
Interesting.
Yeah. So I guess it's the answer, maybe, if I may, then possibly lies in advancing in the tech side and getting the public more on board with what is available in the tech.
Good point.
Fantastic. And Dr. Davies, I mean, another question I've received is on that slide that you showed, which I think is the most important, maybe the most topical slide, was your barriers to EV adoption. Is only 10% of South Africans feeling that cost is a barrier to adoption, where what we're hearing through a lot of speakers is that they're feeling that when we hit that price point of 500,000 is that's when we're going to see a rapid adoption of EVs, because at the moment we're dealing with luxury sedans. So a little bit of a conflicting statement saying only 10% are worried about the cost from your guys' side. Can you maybe just shed a bit more light? Is it how do we go about that? Because I've got questions here. Yeah.
Maybe South Africans, maybe 3 points. First, we spend way above our means.
Yeah.
Second, it's not about affordability. It's about a propensity to spend. And that's a subtle but important difference. And thirdly, I think interestingly, you'll see a trend emerging where the headline cost of a vehicle becomes irrelevant. It's more about the monthly servicing cost of the debt. So you've even seen in some markets now people saying, well, we're going to literally not going to publicize the cost of the vehicle, the headline cost, whether it's 500,000 Rand or 50,000 pound or 100,000 pound, whatever it may be. It's all about the financing. What's your monthly cost? That's what we need to know. We're not going to tell you, we will literally not tell you what the price of a vehicle is. So maybe that's a strategy to say from a retail perspective, okay, forget about the headline cost. You're not paying, because it's a big psychological hurdle to overcome if you think you've got to pay, I don't know, 1.5 million Rand for a new electric vehicle. So rather they say, well, we're not going to tell you what the cost is, but for the next 2 years or 4 years or 5 years, you're paying X amount per month. And then that'll negate the reality of high cost, but it's about the monthly serviceability of the debt, that relatively low figure that consumers will look at, particularly South African consumers, and not the headline cost. I think that's what's going to happen in the EV sector. That's a bit of a medium-term projection.
Thank you. Dr. Davies, I think Yaku's got one more question, and I know you're a very busy man, so we're going to let you go. Yaku, fire away.
So, Dr. Davies, just I think interesting scenario. Earlier in your presentation, you quickly referred to a Zimbabwean scenario. Now, interesting what we've noted actually specifically in Zimbabwe, mainly driven due to massive fuel shortages. I recall when I was there a couple of years ago, I couldn't find fuel at all. So that really is range anxiety, as you call it. Now, what we are seeing, however, in the Zimbabwean context and starting to see that in South African context is what is always available there, and that is solar. So if we're talking solar charging of electric vehicles, all of a sudden it changes that perspective. So there's been a big adoption, and the biggest relative big adoption in Zimbabwe of electric vehicles purely due to that availability of power, due to it being available from the sun. We know there's power issues there as well. How do you think that would influence, and if we're talking, all the challenges we might be facing in the form of load shedding, in the form of possible fuel shortages in time, no reference to any wars happening at this stage, but how would that possibly also influence as we refer to the hockey stick, quicker adoption of EVs in South Africa, in your view?
Very interesting point. I think it's, we have that not unique, but definitely predominant sort of resource that is sunlight down here in this part of the world compared to our European friends. I think a lot of this is going to come about liberalization of energy policy in each particular country. And that'll be ideal. It comes to, the greatest opportunity in Africa is in countries like ours in Africa, amongst others, is the private provision of public goods and services, because the state simply cannot do so. And one of the basic fundamentals of public goods and services, infrastructure, of which energy. So providing the state can liberalize, the technology is there, and it'll come very quickly if it's not. Providing the state can liberalize, allow people to do what they want to do around their own energy generation and provision and possible sale, then the sooner the solutions will be found. Because if you're relying on a government ministry for wherever you may be, for solutions around new tech, no, you're going to have a long wait, unless you're living in Singapore or Korea, or maybe China.
Fantastic.
So watch your space, energy liberalization, privatization, that's what it's about.